Yeah, literally it happens all the time. It's funny because you get into those scenarios and I think I know everything.
Danielle Colby has finally broken her silence on Frank Fritz. And what she revealed painted a far more painful picture of the fallout behind American Pickers. For years, Danielle remained on the sidelines while the story of Frank and Mike Wolfe played out publicly, with tension, distance, and unanswered questions building behind the scenes of American Pickers. Now, following Frank's passing, she has spoken, reflecting on the realities that were hidden beneath the show's surface. What exactly did she witness during those years? And which long-standing rumors is she finally confirming now? Join us as we unravel the truth behind Danielle Colby's revelations about Frank Fritz. Danielle finally speaks out.
I think that honestly, the people here are priceless. The
so
people here have
nice.
been my greatest find.
For years, viewers closely followed the growing distance between Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe through interviews, cast absences, and noticeable changes in the tone of American Pickers. During that period, Danielle Colby remained largely quiet in public. Unlike the constant speculation surrounding the show, she avoided taking sides openly or turning the situation into a public dispute. When she later spoke more directly about the fallout, her comments pointed to a long-term breakdown shaped by years of pressure inside the production, rather than one dramatic incident behind the scenes. According to Danielle, the version of events viewers saw on television represented only part of what was happening within the group. The change was gradual rather than sudden, which made it less noticeable during the earlier stages. Conversations became more work-focused, and the chemistry that defined earlier seasons appeared less natural. By the time audiences began questioning Frank's reduced presence and the visible shift in the show's energy, the underlying problems had already existed for quite some time. The tension reflected years of personal strain, health issues, production demands, and changing relationships within the show itself. Her perspective reframed the fallout not as a sudden collapse, but as the result of gradual separation between people who had spent years working closely together under increasingly difficult circumstances. That is where the real story begins, because the breakdown did not start when the public first noticed it. It had already been unfolding long before that moment reached the screen. The fallout behind the cameras. For years, their partnership on American Pickers depended on constant movement, long road trips, and a shared routine that kept them in close contact. That rhythm eventually changed in a way neither the audience nor, at first, the production fully anticipated. The COVID-19 period marked a turning point that made the distance impossible to ignore. The pandemic affected every aspect of television production across the country, and American Pickers was no exception. Filming schedules were disrupted, travel stopped, and the constant physical closeness that defined the show disappeared almost overnight. What had always been a road-based format suddenly shifted into separation, with each person operating in a more isolated space than before. The informal conversations that used to happen between locations, warehouses, and small towns were no longer part of daily life. As that structure faded, communication changed as well. Messages replaced conversations, and check-ins replaced the natural flow of interaction that comes from shared work environments. What had once been effortless coordination turned into brief, scheduled exchanges. Frank later reflected on this period as one where the separation went beyond logistics. It extended into how people related to each other. Without the routine of filming and travel, there was less opportunity to rebuild small moments of connection that usually hold long working relationships together. Danielle, the third presence in the trio, was positioned within the operational side of the show and witnessed the shift from a different angle. The trio still functioned in a professional sense, but the flow between them was no longer the same. Even when production eventually resumed, the environment felt different. However, COVID itself did not create the underlying tension. It exposed what had already begun to change. The structure that had supported their relationship relied heavily on constant interaction. Once that was removed, what remained was a connection that had already been under pressure from years of demanding schedules and the natural strain of long-term collaboration in a public setting. So, when filming restarted, there was no clean reset. The gap created during the shutdown had already widened into something more permanent. Even when they appeared together again on screen, the underlying tone had shifted. The road trips continued. The format remained intact, but the relationship that once powered it no longer operated with the same ease. What had changed during that period did not announce itself loudly, but it stayed in place long after production moved forward. While the growing distance between Frank and Mike drew attention, another struggle was quietly unfolding behind the scenes, one tied less to conflict and more to the personal battles Frank had carried for years. The hidden struggles.
It's like putting a fat kid in a candy store.
Texaco gasoline, localized for you. I like that.
I think if you look on the back, it's got, yeah, there's your name.
Long before Frank disappeared from the show, his health had already begun reshaping his daily life. This health condition changed how he moved through work and daily life. Even during the strongest years of American Pickers, he was dealing with chronic back problems alongside Crohn's disease, a long-term inflammatory condition that often comes with pain, fatigue, and unpredictable flare-ups. These challenges did not remove him from the show immediately, but they gradually made the pace of filming more demanding. American Pickers was not a studio production. It required constant travel, physical movement through cluttered spaces, lifting, climbing, and long hours spent on the road. Over time, that rhythm became harder to maintain. The work that once matched Frank's natural energy started to demand more from him than before. Those around the production began to notice that his presence was still steady, but his stamina and consistency were no longer the same. As filming continued season after season, the strain became more visible. Days that once felt routine began to require more recovery time. The physical nature of the job, combined with existing medical issues, created a situation where every trip carried additional weight. Alongside the physical challenges, personal difficulties also began to surface. Frank later spoke about periods in his life where stability became harder to maintain, and those struggles added another layer to what he was already dealing with physically. Pain management, long-term illness, and personal pressure combined into a situation that did not allow for a simple resolution. Danielle later described that the version of Frank she first worked alongside during the early years of the series felt different from the one she saw in later seasons. However, something happened that made the situation more significant. In 2020, Frank stopped appearing on the show. Initially, fans thought it was a one-off episode thing, but the absence from the show eventually became permanent. Fans looked for clear explanations, but what emerged instead was a layered reality shaped by health and long-term strain. His departure was not the result of one decision alone. It reflected a buildup of conditions that had been developing quietly for years. When production continued without him, the structure of the show adjusted, but the absence remained noticeable. The rhythm of the series had always depended on a balance between personalities, and removing one of its central figures altered that balance in a way that could not be fully replaced. By the time everything settled into a new pattern, Frank's personal circumstances had already changed the direction of his life in ways that went far beyond television. What the audience saw as an exit was only the visible point of a process that had been unfolding long before it reached the screen. As the debate grew louder, Danielle's perspective made one thing clear: where her loyalty ultimately stood. Danielle's loyalty. When Danielle Colby addressed the situation, she did not position herself as a judge of who was right or wrong. Instead, her words made it clear that she was not interested in assigning blame or feeding the public divide that had grown around Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe. Her perspective leaned heavily on experience rather than speculation. Having spent years within the structure of American pickers, she understood how the environment shaped people differently over time. What stood out most in her reflection was where her loyalty lay. Danielle did not present herself as neutral. Instead, her loyalty was rooted in familiarity and shared history with Mike Wolfe. Long before American Pickers existed, Danielle's connection to Mike Wolfe had already been built through years of personal history rather than television. Their earliest interactions reportedly traced back to Iowa, where a small encounter at a yard sale introduced them to each other's personalities long before fame entered the picture. What began as a minor exchange over an antique item gradually turned into a lasting friendship rooted in shared interests and familiarity with the antique world. As Mike continued developing antique archaeology in LeClaire, Iowa, Danielle became part of that journey early on. That long history helps explain why her perspective on the fallout surrounding Frank often leaned closer to Mike's side of the experience. Her loyalty did not suddenly appear during the conflict itself. It had been shaped by years of friendship, and that connection shaped how she interpreted the changes that unfolded over the years. However, it was not framed as opposition toward Frank, but as alignment with someone whose work rhythm and presence she had consistently shared from the beginning. At the same time, she avoided painting Frank as the problem. Her comments resisted that kind of simplification. Instead, she described a situation where people change within the same environment at different speeds. One person may adapt to the pressures of production differently than another, and over time, those differences can create distance that feels personal, even when it is not driven by a single event. From her view, the story was not about betrayal or confrontation. It was about evolution, both professional and personal, happening unevenly across years of shared work. Still, her alignment with Mike's side of the experience came through in subtle but consistent ways. She acknowledged the strain without dramatizing it, claiming it's not in her place to speak ill of him. She then spoke of Mike's role as something stable that helped sustain continuity even as other dynamics shifted. That framing naturally placed her closer to his perspective of events, even without her explicitly declaring allegiance. What she left unsaid was just as important as what she confirmed. There was no attempt to rewrite history, no effort to elevate one version of events as absolute truth. Instead, she allowed space for contradiction, recognizing that each person involved likely carried their own version of what happened and why it happened. That restraint reinforced the sense that she was not speaking to settle scores, but to acknowledge complexity. In the end, her comments reframed the entire conversation around loyalty itself. At the center of everything was the friendship that once made the show work. The friendship that completely collapsed. Frank had later explained that communication between them had already broken down long before he officially stepped away from the show. Instead of regular contact, there were long stretches of silence. Without consistent interaction, there was no opportunity to clear misunderstandings or address the tension. What remained in its place were assumptions, each side forming its own version of events without direct conversation to correct it. As time went on, Frank also began to feel a shift in how he fit within the structure of the series. The show continued to grow around him, but his presence within its direction appeared less pronounced. Whether this came from production decisions or natural evolution of the format, it changed how he experienced his role. Decisions appeared to move forward without his input, and Robbie Wolfe's increased presence reinforced that perception. The sense of shared ownership that once defined the partnership no longer felt balanced in the same way. Frank spoke about feeling abandoned during one of the most difficult periods of his life. He mentioned that Mike never spoke to him for 2 years. He believed that after his surgery, there was little to no direct contact from Mike or the production team. Danielle also acknowledged this, saying there were no consistent check-ins and no sense of support between Mike and Frank. He knew my back was messed up, but he didn't call me up and ask how I was doing. That's just how it is, Frank said. Mike's account, shared through interviews and public comments, focused more on personal distance and unresolved tension that built up across the years. One of the factors that reportedly contributed to the distance between Mike and Frank was Frank's struggle with addiction. Mike has suggested in interviews that stepping back was partly about maintaining boundaries and avoiding influences that could affect his own stability and the direction of the show. Both perspectives pointed to the same outcome, though they differed on its cause and progression. By the time the public became fully aware of the situation, the separation had already settled into place behind the scenes. The visible absence of Frank was not the starting point of the breakdown, but the final stage of a process that had been unfolding quietly for years. The connection that once defined the show no longer existed in its original form, leaving behind a structure that continued without the relationship that helped shape its foundation. What began as distance eventually settled into something far more final, reshaping everything that came after. A goodbye that changed everything. Neither side ever fully disclosed everything in public, but by then, the distance between them was impossible to ignore. The situation then took a tragic turn for Frank. In July 2022, Frank suffered a severe stroke at his home in Iowa. Emergency responders transported him to a hospital, where he began a long and difficult recovery process. The stroke reportedly left him with significant physical limitations and affected his speech and mobility. Later reports indicated he required guardianship due to concerns about his ability to manage his personal care and finances independently. Frank Fritz died on September 30, 2024, at the age of 60. Reports linked his death to complications from the stroke, along with existing health conditions affecting his heart and lungs. His death closed a chapter that had already been fading for years. By that point, the story surrounding American Pickers was no longer just about television or production changes. It had become a long trail of distance, silence, and unresolved emotion that stretched far beyond what viewers ever saw on screen. The announcement of his passing brought the entire history of the show back into focus. However, it was done through a lens shaped by reflection rather than conflict. In the days that followed, attention shifted again to the relationships that once defined the series. Instead of returning to disagreement or revisiting old tensions, Danielle focused on memory. She described Frank as someone who had a distinct presence during the early years of filming, someone whose energy shaped the pace and personality of the show when it was still forming its identity. Her reflections didn't ignore the strain of the later years, but she didn't reduce Frank to those moments either. She acknowledged the distance and difficulty while still recognizing that earlier years on the road carried a very different energy, built on routine, familiarity, and shared experience. What stood out was her refusal to flatten his story into one version. Frank, in her view, couldn't be defined by a single period or label. He shifted over time, like people often do under pressure, and her comments simply held both realities without trying to force a final judgment. Around the same time, Mike Wolfe also spoke publicly about Frank's passing. He confirmed that he had visited Frank before his death, claiming that he was at his bedside holding his hands for about an hour before he passed. This detail added another dimension to a relationship many had assumed remained fully distant in its final years. His reflection carried a more personal tone, emphasizing long familiarity and shared history that stretched back long before television's success. Even with the distance that had developed between them, the connection was not described as something completely erased. The audience reactions to Frank's passing reflected a mix of emotions. Many returned to earlier episodes, viewing them with a different awareness of what had unfolded behind the scenes. Scenes that once felt routine now carried a different weight, shaped by knowledge of everything that came later. At the same time, others focused on how the show itself had changed over time, noting that its original rhythm and chemistry could not be replicated once its central dynamic shifted. With Frank gone, American Pickers continued in a different form. The absence of Frank created a gap that was not easily filled by new arrangements or cast adjustments. Robbie Wolfe's increased screen presence was part of that transition, but reactions were mixed. Some viewers accepted the change as necessary for production continuity, while others consistently measured it against the earlier dynamic that had defined the series' peak years. For some viewers, the show's identity had been permanently tied to the original trio, and anything after that felt like a different version of the same concept. Ultimately, there was no clean resolution. Danielle's reflections, Mike's acknowledgments, and the audience's response all pointed to the same truth. Some relationships don't end in a single moment or final conversation. They fade over time, shift under pressure, and eventually become something remembered rather than continued. Frank's story in that world didn't end with closure. It ended with recognition, memory, and the quiet understanding that meaning often comes only after the fact. Do you think the truth behind Frank and Mike was more complicated than it looked on screen? And did American Pickers ever truly recover after everything that happened? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.